India, 1999. Part 1. Mumbai's most respected surgeon. The city that never slept was alive with a hum of chaos. The cacophony of car horns, the persistent chatter of people, and the endless flow of life made it a city of both dreams and desperation. Amidst this constant motion stood Dr. Ravi Kapoor, a man as sharp and unwavering as the surgical instruments he wielded. Known throughout India as a surgeon of extraordinary talent, his name commanded both respect and envy in the medical community. For years, his hands had saved lives, delivering patients from the brink of death. But to him, it was all skill, pure methodical skill. There was no room for anything beyond that, least of all faith. The sterile white walls of the hospital stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, unpredictable world outside. Within these walls, Ravi Kapoor ruled with precision and order. His surgical team followed his every instruction with mechanical efficiency, knowing that any deviation from his commands would invite his cold, sharp reprimands. To them, Dr. Kapoor wasn't just a surgeon, he was a force of nature. His tall, imposing figure moved through the hospital hallways like a shadow, his crisp white coat billowing behind him, and his piercing eyes, always calculating, missing nothing. Ravi's approach to life had been forged in the fires of discipline and skepticism. Raised in a family that valued academia over spirituality, Ravi had turned away from religion at a young age. While others sought answers in prayer, he sought them in science. To him, the universe was a series of equations, each problem solvable if approached with the right mindset. Faith, that was a crutch for the weak, a way for people to explain what they didn't understand. One late evening, the hospital's emergency room was thrown into a frenzy. A terrible car accident had occurred in the heart of Mumbai, and among the casualties was a young boy no older than 10. His body was a mess of broken bones and bruised flesh, his breathing faint and labored. The paramedics hurriedly wheeled him into the emergency room, shouting vitals and stats to the awaiting doctors. Nurses scrambled, setting up IVs and prepping for immediate intervention, but the mood in the room was grim. The boy, Arif, had lost a significant amount of blood, and his chances of survival were slim. Dr. Kapoor was called in immediately. As he arrived in the trauma unit, the chaos seemed to quiet, not because the situation improved, but because his presence commanded it. He surveyed the scene with the calm, analytical eyes of a man who had faced death countless times and won. His team stood by, waiting for his orders. "Prep the ore. We're taking him in," Dr. Kapoor said, his voice cool and steady, betraying none of the urgency that lingered in the air. The medical staff sprang into action, rolling the boy toward the operating room. Ravi followed closely, mentally preparing for what he knew would be a difficult surgery. As he scrubbed in, his mind was already running through the steps. Broken ribs, punctured lung, internal bleeding. There was no time to hesitate. Every second mattered. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense. The bright overhead lights illuminated Arif's small body on the table, surrounded by a sea of masked surgeons and nurses. Dr. Kapoor took his position, and as the surgical team stood ready, he gave the order to begin. Time seemed to blur as Ravi worked. His hands moved with precision, cutting and stitching with a skill that only years of practice could bring. Every decision was calculated, every movement deliberate. The boy's heart rate was erratic, fluctuating dangerously as the team fought to stabilize him. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors and the soft clinking of surgical instruments. But then the unthinkable happened. Ar's heart stopped. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor flatlined, the sound piercing the silence like a knife. The team froze, eyes wide, waiting for Dr. Kapoor's command. "Clear," Ravi barked, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. The electric shock jolted the boy's body, but the line on the monitor remained flat. Another shock, then another, nothing. The seconds stretched into minutes, and with each passing moment, the chances of bringing Arif back dwindled. "Come on," Ravi muttered under his breath, his frustration mounting. He applied another shock, but still nothing. The operating room grew heavier with a sense of impending loss. The nurses exchanged anxious glances, knowing that soon, Dr. Kapoor would have to make the call. But Ravi wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. His reputation was built on achieving the impossible, and he wasn't about to let a young boy slip away under his care. Another shock. Still nothing. The room held its breath. And then, against all odds, the faintest blip appeared on the monitor. A heartbeat, weak at first, but steadying with each passing second. The room erupted in silent relief. Ravi exhaled, his body releasing the tension it had been holding for what felt like an eternity. Arav was alive, barely but alive. As the team worked to stabilize the boy, something unusual happened. Arav, though unconscious, began to murmur. His lips moved faintly, forming words too soft for anyone to hear. Ravi leaned in, curious, but brushed it off as post-traumatic delirium. The surgery concluded successfully, and Arav was wheeled to the ICU for recovery. Dr. Kapoor, though tired, felt a surge of satisfaction. He had done it again, another life saved, another testament to the power of modern medicine. Yet there was something about this case that nagged at him, something he couldn't quite put into words. Before leaving the hospital that night, Ravi decided to check on Arav one last time. He stood by the boy's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. The boy looked so fragile, his small body connected to machines that beeped rhythmically in the dimly lit room. Ravi's mind wandered back to the moment in the OR when everything had seemed lost. How close they had come to losing him. And then, as if on cue, Arav's eyes fluttered open. The boy's gaze was unfocused at first, but when he saw Dr. Kapoor, a small, almost peaceful smile spread across his face. "I saw him," Arav whispered, his voice barely audible. "God, he told me, you're chosen." Ravi stiffened, his mind immediately rejecting the words. It was a hallucination, a dream induced by trauma. The boy had been through a near-death experience. It wasn't uncommon for patients to have strange visions. But something in Arav's expression unsettled him. The boy's eyes held a serenity, a calmness that belied his condition. "You should rest," Ravi said. His voice clipped as he turned to leave the room. But Arav's words echoed in his mind long after he walked out of the hospital. Part 2. A Surgeon's Disbelief. Apartment in the heart of Mumbai was a reflection of the man himself. Orderly, minimalist, and devoid of unnecessary distractions. The sleek, modern furniture was carefully chosen, each piece serving a purpose, just like the precise instruments in his operating room. A large glass window stretched from floor to ceiling, offering an impressive view of the city's skyline, where the sea of lights sparkled like stars against the night. Yet, for all its splendor, the city seemed far away from Ravi's mind tonight. He sat at his desk, surrounded by patient files and medical journals, but his focus wasn't on the pages in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the day, to the boy Arav. The boy's whispered words haunted him, echoing in the back of his mind like a lingering specter. "God, he told me you're chosen." The logical part of Ravi dismissed it as the ramblings of a traumatized child, but there was a crack in his usual certainty, and through that crack, doubt began to seep in. The silence in his apartment was thick, almost oppressive. Ravi leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if to chase away the unsettling thoughts. He had spent his entire life believing in what could be proven, in what could be measured and understood. The idea that something beyond science could influence reality was absurd to him. But then, why did he feel this gnawing unease? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that there was more to what had happened in that operating room? With a sigh, Ravi pushed himself up from the chair and walked over to the large window, staring out into the vastness of the city. The familiar hum of Mumbai's nightlife, cars honking, distant conversations, the faint sound of music, usually brought him a sense of comfort. It was the predictable chaos that grounded him. But tonight, even that felt distant, as if he were watching it all from behind a glass barrier. He was a man of science, A man who had spent his life in pursuit of knowledge, of understanding the human body in all its complexities. Faith, to him, was the absence of reason. It was a crutch people leaned on when they couldn't explain the world around them. And yet, in that moment when R's heart had stopped, when the boy was suspended between life and death, something unexplainable had happened. Ravi clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up inside him. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but this was different. He couldn't deny the feeling that had washed over him during the surgery. It was as if something beyond his control, had intervened. But how could he, a man who had built his career on rationality and logic, entertain such a thought? He turned away from the window and paced the length of the room. The soft thud of his footsteps against the hardwood floor was the only sound breaking the silence. His thoughts were racing now, and he couldn't stop them. The more he tried to dismiss what had happened, the more it consumed him. He had heard of near-death experiences before, patients who claimed to have seen the afterlife, to have met God. But he had always dismissed such stories as nothing more than the brain's response to trauma. Hallucinations, delusions. But this felt different. It wasn't just R's words. It was the way he had looked at him. The boy's eyes had been filled with a clarity, a certainty, that Ravi couldn't explain. And then there were the murmurs in the operating room. He had leaned in, trying to catch what the boy was saying, but the words had been too faint, too jumbled. Still, there was something unsettling about the way Arav had spoken, as if he were seeing something that no one else could. Ravi shook his head, trying to rid himself of these thoughts. He wasn't going to allow a few strange moments to undermine everything he believed in. He had saved the boy's life. He had done it, not some mystical force or divine intervention. His training, his skill, his experience, they were the reasons Arav was still alive. And yet, that lingering doubt continued to tug at the edges of his mind. In a moment of frustration, Ravi grabbed his phone and called Dr. Suresh Nanda, his closest colleague and friend. If there was anyone who could help him make sense of this, it was Suresh. The phone rang several times before Suresh answered, his voice groggy from sleep. "Ravi, it's late. What's going on?" "I know. I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to talk to someone," Ravi said, his voice tense. Suresh yawned on the other end of the line. "This better be important. I was just getting some rest after a 12-hour shift." Ravi hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's about the boy, Arav. Something happened during the surgery." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it, but after the surgery, the boy woke up and said something strange. He said that God spoke to him, that I was chosen for some kind of mission," Ravi explained, feeling absurd even as the words left his mouth. Suresh let out a chuckle, his voice laced with amusement. "Ravi, come onorevole. You know how it is? Patients say all kinds of things after a traumatic experience. It's probably just his brain trying to make sense of what happened. You don't actually believe there's anything to it, do you?" Ravi sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, of course not. It's just the way he said it. It felt different. And there were these strange things happening during the surgery. I can't explain it. Look, man, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you're just overthinking it. You saved the kid's life. That's what matters. Forget about all this chosen nonsense. It's just a coincidence," Suresh said, trying to reassure him. Ravi wanted to believe him. He wanted to brush off the whole thing as just another strange occurrence in a long career filled with life-or-death moments. But deep down, something told him that this wasn't just a coincidence. Still, he didn't push the issue with Suresh. "Yeah, maybe you're right," Ravi finally replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Get some sleep, Ravi. You'll feel better in the morning," Suresh said before hanging up. Ravi put his phone down and stood in the middle of his living room, feeling more conflicted than ever. He didn't want to admit it, but Suresh's casual dismissal of the situation didn't sit well with him. The rational part of his mind told him to forget about it, to move on. But something deeper, something more primal, kept pulling him back to R's words. The apartment felt suffocating now, the silence no longer comforting. Ravi needed air. He grabbed his jacket and stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night breeze hitting his face as he leaned against the railing. The city stretched out before him, vast and endless, its lights flickering like a living organism. He watched as the traffic below moved in slow, deliberate patterns like blood coursing through veins. But despite the city's vibrancy, Ravi felt a profound sense of isolation. For the first time in years, he questioned his place in the world. Was there something beyond the science he had devoted his life to? Could there be forces at work that he had spent his entire career denying? He wasn't ready to answer those questions yet, but he couldn't ignore them either. As the night wore on, Ravi stood on the balcony, lost in thought, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. What had started as a normal day had turned into something he couldn't explain, something that left him grappling with forces beyond his understanding. He stayed outside until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the city. But even as the day began anew, the questions remained. Part 3. The Unseen Hand. The hospital corridors buzzed with the familiar sounds of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of voices. Dr. Ravi Kapoor moved through the hallways with his usual confidence, but inside, his mind was anything but settled. He had spent the past few days trying to immerse himself in work, hoping that the routine of surgeries and patient care would drown out the lingering doubts that had plagued him since his conversation with Arif. Yet, no matter how much he tried to focus on the tangible, on the science and medicine that had always been his anchor, the boy's words still haunted him. He had to admit, reluctantly, that something was changing. For years, Ravi had prided himself on his ability to remain detached from his patients. He saw them as cases to be solved, puzzles to be unraveled by the sharp scalpel of his intellect. Emotions, spirituality, and any notion of faith had no place in his world. But lately, he found himself drawn to moments he couldn't easily explain. Small things at first, like the feeling that someone was watching him as he operated, or the fleeting sense that he wasn't alone in the room, even when the other surgeons had left. It was during a particularly difficult surgery that everything came to a head. That afternoon, Ravi was called into an emergency operation. A middle-aged woman had been brought in with a ruptured aneurysm, a ticking time bomb in her brain. The prognosis was grim. Even with immediate surgery, the chances of survival were slim. Ravi prepped quickly, his mind methodically running through the procedure as he scrubbed in. He had performed dozens of surgeries like this before, and though they were always high risk, he knew what needed to be done. As he entered the operating room, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The medical staff moved with a sense of urgency, setting up the instruments, monitoring the patient's vitals. The woman lay unconscious on the table, her life hanging by a thread. Ravi took his place at the head of the operating table, his hands steady as ever. The overhead lights gleamed off the polished metal of the surgical tools, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoed in the sterile room. For the first hour, everything went as expected. Ravi's hands worked with their usual precision, navigating the delicate structures of the brain with expertise. But as the surgery progressed, things began to spiral out of control. The patient's blood pressure dropped sharply, and despite their best efforts, the medical team struggled to stabilize her. Ravi felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple as he issued commands, his voice tight with concentration. "Push more fluids. We need to get her pressure back up," he ordered, his tone clipped but calm. The nurses moved quickly, adjusting the four, but the numbers on the monitor continued to fall. Suddenly, the heart monitor flatlined. Panic rippled through the room. Nurses and anesthetists scrambled to revive the woman, administering medications and performing chest compressions. Ravi's mind raced. He had been in high-stakes situations before, but this felt different. There was a sense of impending failure that gnawed at him, a sinking realization that despite all his skill, all his years of training, he might lose her. And then, amidst the chaos, it happened again. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible at first, seemed to whisper in the back of his mind. "Pray." Ravi froze. His hands hovered above the patient, but his attention was no longer on the surgery. The voice was clearer this time, more insistent. He blinked, trying to shake off the feeling, but it wouldn't leave him. Pray? The very idea was absurd. He hadn't prayed in years, not since he was a boy. He had spent his life in the pursuit of knowledge, in the pursuit of solutions that could be found in textbooks and medical journals. Prayer had no place here in the sterile, controlled environment of the operating room. But the voice persisted. Pray. Robbie's heart pounded in his chest, louder than the flat line of the heart monitor, louder than the frantic voices of his team. For the first time in his career, he felt something he wasn't used to: helplessness. He had done everything right. He had followed every procedure, made every calculated move, and yet here he was, on the verge of losing a life. Against every rational thought in his mind, Robbie found himself whispering a quiet plea. It wasn't a grand, eloquent prayer. It wasn't even directed at any deity in particular. It was raw, desperate, a simple cry for help. If you're there, if you're real, help me save her. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but as soon as they left his lips, something changed. Robbie couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere in the room shifted. His hands steadied, the tremor that had begun to creep into his fingers disappeared, and a strange calm washed over him. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was simply moving, as if guided by some unseen force. His hands found the exact place they needed to be, performing a series of delicate maneuvers with a precision that felt beyond him. And then the impossible happened. The heart monitor let out a faint beep. Then another. Slowly, the flat line gave way to a weak but steady rhythm. The woman's heart had started beating again. The room, which had been filled with frenetic energy moments before, fell into stunned silence. The nurses and doctors exchanged wide-eyed glances, their shock palpable. No one spoke, but the relief was tangible. Robbie stood there, his hands still poised over the patient, his mind reeling. He didn't know how to process what had just happened. The rest of the surgery went smoothly. The woman stabilized, and though she was still in critical condition, she had a fighting chance. A chance that, by all medical standards, she shouldn't have had. As Robbie finished the procedure and stepped away from the table, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had saved her, but not in the way he was used to. After the surgery, Robbie retreated to the scrub room, his hands trembling as he washed the blood from his fingers. The water ran in swirling red patterns down the drain, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by what had just transpired. Could it really be a coincidence? Was it possible that his quiet, desperate plea had somehow made a difference? The idea unsettled him, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. He wasn't a man prone to superstition. He didn't believe in divine intervention or miracles. But this was different. He had felt something in that moment, something beyond logic and reason. He had felt guided. Robbie stared at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. The man who looked back at him seemed familiar, yet different. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the armor of certainty he had worn for so long. He had always been so sure of himself, so sure of the world he lived in. But now, that certainty was unraveling. As he left the scrub room, Robbie's mind raced with questions. He walked through the hospital in a daze, barely registering the familiar faces of colleagues and patients. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as he made his way to the ICU to check on the woman. When he arrived, he found her resting peacefully, her breathing steady, her vitals stable. He stood by her bedside for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. There was no medical explanation for her recovery, no logical reason why she had survived. And yet, here she was alive. The weight of the moment pressed down on Robbie. He couldn't shake the feeling that something greater had been at play, something beyond his understanding. It terrified him, but it also filled him with a strange sense of wonder. As he left the ICU, Robbie felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He wasn't ready to call it faith, not yet. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure that science held all the answers. Something had changed, and whether he liked it or not, Robbie knew he couldn't ignore it. Part 4. The Awakening. The streets of Mumbai were uncharacteristically quiet as dawn's first light crept over the horizon. The city, usually filled with noise and life, seemed to be holding its breath. The sky was a soft gradient of pale pinks and oranges, casting a warm glow over the concrete jungle below. Dr. Ravi Kapoor walked with his hands in his pockets, his steps slow and deliberate, as though he were carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts on his shoulders. Ravi hadn't slept much in the days following the surgery. His mind was a relentless whirlpool of questions that no medical journal or textbook could answer. For as long as he could remember, he had seen the world through the lens of science, dissecting every aspect of life into explainable, measurable parts. But now, standing on the precipice of something beyond his understanding, he felt unmoored. The events in the operating room had shaken him to his core. He had never been a man of faith, and yet something had intervened during that surgery. The voice, the calm that had washed over him, the steadying of his hands, it all pointed to something beyond the realm of reason. He couldn't explain it, and that terrified him. He had spent his entire life building walls of logic and reason, and now those walls were beginning to crumble. As he wandered through the narrow lanes of the city, the early morning air felt cool against his skin. The scent of freshly brewed chai wafted from a nearby vendor's stall, mingling with the smell of wet earth from the recent rains. Normally, such simple pleasures grounded him, but today they barely registered. His mind was too preoccupied with what lay ahead. Without realizing it, Ravi's feet led him to a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. It was a small, tucked-away neighborhood on the outskirts of Mumbai, where time seemed to slow down. The narrow streets were lined with modest homes, their walls painted in faded shades of blue and green. In the center of this quiet area stood a small temple, its stone facade weathered by time, but still standing strong, like a beacon of faith amidst the chaos of the city. Ravi stopped in front of the temple, staring up at the entrance as if seeing it for the first time. He had grown up in a household that observed religious customs, but those traditions had faded from his life long ago, replaced by his obsession with science and medicine. He had stopped believing in the divine, stopped praying, stopped searching for anything beyond what could be proven. And yet, here he was, standing at the threshold of a place he had once considered irrelevant. The temple was quiet, its doors open wide to welcome the early morning worshippers. The soft hum of prayers floated on the air, blending with the distant sounds of the city waking up. Ravi felt an inexplicable pull, a tugging sensation in his chest that urged him to step inside. He hesitated, his rational mind screaming at him to turn around and leave. But another part of him, the part that had begun to stir during the surgery, pushed him forward. With a deep breath, Ravi crossed the threshold and entered the temple. The inside was dimly lit, with small oil lamps flickering in the corners, casting a warm, golden light over the stone walls. The scent of incense filled the air, mingling with the soft murmurs of prayer. A few worshippers knelt before the altar, their heads bowed in reverence. The atmosphere was calm, serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Ravi's mind. He stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure of what to do. He hadn't prayed in years, and the rituals of faith felt foreign to him now. His hands hung uselessly by his sides as he watched the others with a mix of curiosity and unease. What was he even doing here? He didn't believe in any of this. And yet, here he was, drawn to this place by something he couldn't explain. An elderly priest, draped in simple saffron robes, noticed Ravi standing alone and approached him. The priest's face was lined with years of wisdom and compassion, his eyes kind but knowing. He stopped a few feet away from Ravi, studying him for a moment before speaking. "Welcome, my son," the priest said, his voice soft but steady. "It is not often that we see new faces here at this hour." Ravi shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. I'm not sure why I'm here," he admitted, feeling the weight of the admission settle in his chest. The priest smiled gently, as if he had heard those words many times before. "Sometimes, the heart leads us where the mind cannot follow," he said. "And sometimes, we must listen to that which we cannot understand." Ravi frowned, his skepticism rearing its head. "I'm not a believer. I don't think faith can solve problems. I've built my life around science, around what I can see and prove." The priest nodded, unbothered by Ravi's confession. "Science is a gift, a tool to help us understand the world. But there are some things that science cannot explain, things that exist beyond the reach of logic. Ravi opened his mouth to protest, but the priest continued before he could speak. You have been given a gift, doctor, a glimpse of something greater than yourself. I can see it in your eyes. You've experienced something, haven't you? Ravi's stomach tightened at the priest's words. How could this man, a stranger, know what he had been grappling with? The doubts, the questions, the voice he had heard in the operating room. It all came flooding back in a rush of emotion. I don't know what I experienced, Ravi admitted, his voice quiet. But it was real. I felt something I can't explain. The priest nodded again, his eyes soft with understanding. That is the nature of faith, my son. It is not about understanding everything. It is about embracing the mystery and allowing yourself to trust in what you cannot see. Ravi looked away, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He had spent so many years building his life around certainty, around facts and data. But now, for the first time, he was being asked to let go of that need for control, to step into the unknown. How do I trust something I don't believe in? Ravi asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest smiled once more, a patient, knowing smile. You don't need to believe all at once. Faith is a journey, not a destination. It begins with a single step, one that you have already taken by walking through these doors. Ravi stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the priest's words settling over him like a warm blanket. Could it really be that simple? Could faith and science coexist, not as opposing forces, but as complementary paths? I don't know if I'm ready, Ravi admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. The priest's eyes twinkled with a quiet wisdom. No one ever is, but sometimes the path chooses us, and all we can do is follow. Ravi left the temple not with answers, but with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. The questions still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. Instead, he felt a strange sense of acceptance, as if he had taken the first tentative step towards something new, something bigger than himself. As he walked back through the quiet streets of Mumbai, the sun now fully risen, casting a golden glow over the city, Ravi couldn't help but feel that his journey had only just begun. Faith, he realized, wasn't about abandoning science. It was about allowing himself to see beyond what he knew, to embrace the possibility that there were things in this world that couldn't be measured or explained. For the first time in his life, Ravi Kapoor, the man who had spent years rejecting the unseen, found himself open to the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to life than he had ever imagined. Part 5. A healer of body and soul. The hospital was bathed in the soft, dim glow of evening lights as Dr. Ravi Kapoor made his way through the now familiar corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. It had been months since his life had taken an unexpected turn. Months filled with quiet moments of reflection, doubt, and discovery. The once rigid walls of certainty that had framed his life were now gone, replaced by a willingness to embrace the unknown. Tonight, Ravi found himself drawn to a place he had once avoided, the hospital's small, modest prayer room. The prayer room was tucked away in a quiet corner of the hospital, its unassuming door easily overlooked by the bustling staff and patients. Inside, the room was simple, wooden benches arranged in neat rows, soft candles flickering at the altar, and the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. The space was peaceful, a sanctuary from the frenetic energy of the hospital outside. It was a place where families came to seek solace, to pray for miracles, to find strength when medicine alone was not enough. Ravi paused at the entrance, his hand resting on the doorframe. He hadn't come here to pray, at least not in the traditional sense. But something about this room, about the quiet reverence it held, called to him. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The room was empty save for one woman, an elderly figure with hunched shoulders, kneeling at the altar in silent prayer. Ravi recognized her immediately. Her daughter had been one of his most challenging cases, a young woman who had come into the hospital with a grim prognosis, her life hanging by a thread. Against all odds, she had survived, recovering from injuries that should have claimed her life. The nurses had called it a miracle. Ravi, in his new state of mind, had quietly agreed. As Ravi sat on one of the benches, his thoughts drifted back to the surgery that had changed everything for him. The moment when he had felt something larger than himself take hold. The voice, the calm, the sense of being guided. It was no longer something he could explain away. He had tried, in those early days, to rationalize it, to fit it neatly into his understanding of the world. But now, after months of grappling with his beliefs, he knew better. There were some things that defied explanation. He had seen it in the eyes of his patients, those who had brushed against the veil of death and returned with stories of light, of peace, of something beyond this life. He had dismissed them before, but now he listened. He listened with an open heart, knowing that their experiences, like his own, were real, even if they couldn't be proven. The door to the prayer room creaked open, and Ravi looked up to see Arav, the boy who had started it all. Arav had grown stronger over the months, his once fragile body now brimming with energy. He smiled when he saw Ravi, his eyes bright with the innocence of youth, but there was something else there too, something wise beyond his years. "Hello, Dr. Kapoor," Arav said, his voice soft but clear as he approached the bench. Ravi smiled back, motioning for him to sit beside him. "Arav, how are you feeling?" "I'm good, really good," Arav replied, his eyes scanning the room before they settled on Ravi. "I come here sometimes. It's peaceful." Ravi nodded, looking around the room. "It is." There was a brief silence, one that felt comfortable, as if both of them were content just to sit in each other's presence. But then Arav spoke, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that belied his young age. "I knew you'd be here," he said, his eyes locking onto Ravi's. "I had a feeling." Ravi's heart skipped a beat at the boy's words. He wasn't surprised anymore by Arav's intuition, by the sense that this child, who had once hovered so close to death, was somehow connected to something greater. Ravi had stopped questioning it. Instead, he simply accepted it. "You said something to me once, after your surgery," Ravi began, his voice steady. "You told me that God had spoken to you, that I was chosen. I didn't believe it then. I wasn't sure what to believe. But now I think I understand." Arav's eyes gleamed with the same peaceful wisdom that had unsettled Ravi months ago. "God has a way of showing us what we need to see, even if we're not ready for it," the boy said simply. Ravi smiled, the weight of those words settling over him like a soft blanket. He had spent so long resisting, fighting against the idea that there was more to life than what he could control, than what he could prove. But in the end, it wasn't about control or proof. It was about trust, trusting that there was something beyond him, something guiding him, even if he couldn't always see it. "I think I'm ready to trust that now," Ravi admitted, his voice soft. Arav nodded, his smile never fading. "You were always ready, Dr. Kapoor. You just didn't know it." The two sat in silence for a while, the soft glow of the candles flickering in the dim light. Outside the prayer room, the hospital continued its usual rhythm. Patients being admitted, doctors rushing to emergencies, the steady hum of life and death intertwined in the sterile halls. But inside this room, Ravi felt a sense of calm he hadn't known before. The uncertainty, the fear, the need for control. All of it seemed to melt away, leaving behind only peace. As they sat together, Ravi found himself thinking about the future. He was still a surgeon, still devoted to the art and science of saving lives. But now, he understood that there was more to healing than what his hands could do. There was something beyond the scalpel, beyond the operating table. His patients came to him with broken bodies, but many also came with broken spirits. And now, for the first time, Ravi felt like he was able to heal both. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He was still a man of science. But now, he was also a man of faith that didn't conflict with his work, but rather enhanced it. The two weren't opposing forces, as he had once thought. They were intertwined, each complementing the other in ways he had never imagined. Later that evening, as Ravi left the prayer room and made his way through the quiet hospital halls, he felt lighter than he had in years. The doubts that had once plagued him were still there, but they no longer weighed him down. Instead, they were part of the journey, questions that didn't need immediate answers, but that he was willing to explore. He paused outside the ICU, looking through the window at the patients resting inside. His gaze fell on a young woman, the same patient whose mother had been praying in the temple earlier. She was awake now, sitting up in her bed, her eyes scanning the room. Ravi felt a swell of warmth in his chest as their eyes met briefly through the glass. He smiled, knowing that she was going to be all right. Ravi continued down the hallway, his steps steady and sure. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare him. He was no longer just a healer of bodies. He was a healer of souls. And as he moved forward, he carried with him the quiet assurance that whatever came next, he would be ready. Because now, he knew, faith and science weren't opposites. They were both part of the same beautiful, mysterious journey. And Dr. Ravi Kapoor, once a man bound by logic and reason, was finally free to embrace the unseen. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.